Warsaw, April 19th, 1943. A white vehicle with a red cross painted crudely on its bonnet rattles down Miła Street, past walls still warm from the previous night's fires. To the German sentries waving it through, it looks like exactly what it claims to be, a medical vehicle, tending to the sick in a ghetto that the occupying authorities have just decided to liquidate. Inside, beneath a stretcher and a folded pile of bloodied bandages, lie 4 revolvers, a handful of grenades fashioned from tin cans, and enough ammunition to keep a single machine gun firing for perhaps 90 seconds. The driver does not know if 90 seconds will matter. It might. In a district where the entire Jewish combat organization possesses fewer working firearms than a single German infantry squad, 90 seconds of sustained fire is not a detail. It is the difference between resistance and surrender. This is the story of an idea so simple that almost nobody thought to stop it in time. That the one vehicle every occupying army was obliged, by its own laws of war, to wave through untouched, could be turned into the most efficient smuggling machine of the entire conflict. It was never one ambulance, or one design, or one inventor. It was a method discovered independently in ghettos and villages and city streets across occupied Europe, and it worked precisely because it exploited an assumption too fundamental for anyone to question in the moment. That is why it matters. Not because of the machine, but because of what it reveals about the people who thought to use it. By the winter of 1942, the mathematics of resistance in occupied Europe had become almost absurd. In the Warsaw ghetto, over 400,000 people had been confined behind brick walls topped with broken glass, and by the time organized resistance groups began to form, deportations to Treblinka had already reduced that population by hundreds of thousands. The Jewish underground in Białystok began with a single rifle that had to be physically carried between training units so that each fighter could handle a real weapon before being asked to use one. In Vilna, resistance members shared one revolver and practiced against a mud wall in a basement so the spent bullets could be dug out and reused. Warsaw's Jewish underground began its campaign with 2 pistols. Meanwhile, the ghetto walls themselves were patrolled, the gates searched, and anyone caught carrying so much as a kitchen knife risked immediate execution. Weapons existed on the other side of those walls, in German barracks, in Polish black markets, occasionally in the hands of soldiers who had lost faith in the war and were willing to sell their own rifles. The problem was never simply acquiring a gun, it was moving it. A pistol wrapped in cloth and hidden beneath a coat might survive a glance, but not a search, and searches were constant, arbitrary, and often violent. Meanwhile, further west, French resistance faced a related but distinct dilemma. Arms drops from Britain's Special Operations Executive were maddeningly rare. Until early 1944, only a limited number of aircraft were committed to supplying resistance movements across the whole of occupied Europe, and priority frequently went to partisan groups in Yugoslavia, Italy, and Greece rather than to France. Whatever weapons the resistance did acquire still had to travel from a farmhouse or a forest drop zone into a town under German occupation, past checkpoints designed specifically to catch exactly this kind of movement. Every solution attempted so far had the same flaw: false-bottomed suitcases, hollowed loaves of bread, sacks of potatoes with pistols packed beneath the produce. These methods worked in small volumes, smuggled one weapon or one grenade at a time, at enormous personal risk to a single courier. What was needed was not cleverness in miniature. It was a vehicle that nobody was permitted to stop. The innovation, if it can be called that, was not built in a laboratory or stamped out on a factory floor. It was assembled from what already existed: a motor ambulance, a set of Red Cross markings, and the international laws of war themselves, which every combatant nation had signed and which every combatant nation, to varying degrees, still felt obliged to be seen honoring. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical vehicles displaying the protective emblem were not to be searched, fired upon, or obstructed in their work. German patrols, even deep into 1944, generally still waved genuine ambulances through checkpoints with barely a glance, because to do otherwise invited reciprocal treatment of their own wounded and their own medical transports. Resistance networks across occupied Europe grasped that this single, near-universal courtesy created a blind spot precisely the size of a vehicle's chassis. Couriers moving supplies into and out of the Warsaw ghetto used whatever transport offered concealment, and accounts describe items smuggled in both refuse lorries and ambulances, alongside older methods such as passing bundles through drain pipes. The mechanics of concealment varied with whoever was doing the smuggling, but the underlying logic stayed the same everywhere it appeared. A stretcher, ostensibly carrying a patient, could just as easily conceal a dismantled Sten gun beneath a false canvas lining. Bandaging, rolled in vast quantities for legitimate medical use, was dense enough to muffle the shape and weight of a revolver wrapped inside it. The undercarriage of a converted lorry, fitted out to resemble a field ambulance with white paint and crude red crosses, offered space that no genuine medical vehicle needed and no sentry expected to find occupied. In France, the disguise cut both ways. During the fighting for Paris in August 1944, genuine half-track and lorry ambulances, including vehicles of the Régiment de Marche du Tchad and American medical units, moved constantly through streets still contested by German troops, evacuating wounded fighters from both the Free French forces and the civilian uprising. That constant, legitimate traffic of real medical vehicles made it easier still for a disguised one to pass unremarked, lost in a stream of identical white bonnets and red crosses that German sentries had learned, by necessity and by law, not to interrogate too closely. There was no single production run of these vehicles, no factory ledger recording how many were converted because there was nothing to convert in any industrial sense. A civilian van, a requisitioned lorry, sometimes a vehicle borrowed for a single run and returned by nightfall, needed only paint, markings, and a driver willing to accept that capture meant a fate considerably worse than that of a normal prisoner of war. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The clearest recorded instances come from the couriers of the Jewish underground, women whose ordinary appearance and forged Aryan papers already made them far less likely to be searched than young men. Frumka Płotnicka is credited as the first courier to bring weapons into the Warsaw ghetto, concealing them at the bottom of a sack of potatoes, while Bronka Klebanski in Białystok carried a revolver and 2 grenades hidden inside a loaf of bread. Władka Mead, working the smuggling routes between the Aryan side of Warsaw and the ghetto wall, obtained her first firearm through her landlord's nephew and paid to have it pass through a gap in the wall known as a meta, in a stretch where the guards could be bribed. These operations, run in parallel with vehicle-based smuggling, fed the small arsenal that the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union assembled ahead of the April 1943 uprising, an arsenal that remained pitifully small by any conventional military measure, yet proved sufficient to hold German and auxiliary forces at bay for close to a month in house-to-house fighting, far longer than German commanders had anticipated. In France, ambulances and medical transports moved through the chaos of the liberation, carrying not only the genuinely wounded, but, on occasion, weapons and fighters shifting position between barricades. Precise, verifiable accounts of specific ambulance-based arms runs during the Paris uprising are harder to pin down than the ghetto smuggling record, and honesty demands saying so plainly. Much of what happened on those August streets, amid house-to-house skirmishes and constantly shifting front lines, was never formally logged, and some of what survives comes from memoirs written decades after the event, colored by hindsight and by the understandable wish to dramatize one's own small part in a great liberation. What can be said with confidence is that the general tactic, the use of protected medical markings to move people and material past checkpoints, was recognized and employed widely enough across resistance movements that German occupation forces grew progressively more suspicious of ambulance traffic as the war went on, particularly in the final year, even as international law continued to oblige them to exercise restraint. Compare this to how German forces themselves treated the Red Cross emblem, and a sharper picture emerges. German military doctrine, at least on paper, held to the Geneva Conventions with the same formal respect the Allies did. Yet there are documented instances on the Eastern Front and elsewhere of both Axis and, more rarely, Allied forces exploiting medical markings for military advantage, moving supplies, or even armed personnel under the cover of a Red Cross vehicle. What made the resistance's use of the tactic distinct was scale and desperation rather than novelty. A partisan movement with almost no formal supply chain and no aircraft of its own had far fewer alternatives than a conventional army with lorries, rail transport, and armed convoys at its disposal. Where the Wehrmacht might exploit a medical marking as one option among many, an underground network in Warsaw or a maquis cell in the Auvergne might find it one of only 2 or 3 viable methods of moving anything at all. The Allies, by contrast, generally avoided the tactic at an institutional level precisely because Allied high command depended on German reciprocal restraint to protect its own enormous fleet of genuine ambulances, and any documented misuse risked forfeiting that protection for wounded men who had no part in the deception. It is worth being honest about the ethical weight of all this rather than treating it as a clever wartime trick with no cost. The protective emblem exists because armies on both sides need to move their wounded without being fired upon, and every act of disguise, however justified by desperation, chipped away at the credibility of that protection for everyone else relying on it. The material impact of ambulance smuggling is almost impossible to quantify with any precision, and any documentary that claims otherwise is not being straight with you. Nobody kept a ledger of how many revolvers crossed the Warsaw ghetto wall in a stretcher rather than a bread sack, and nobody could, because survival depended on leaving no such record for the Gestapo to find. What can be assessed is the psychological and organizational effect. The mere existence of a route, however fragile, that could move weapons in meaningful quantities, rather than one pistol at a time, allowed groups like the Jewish Combat Organization to plan an armed response, rather than a purely symbolic one. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, when it came in April 1943, is remembered precisely because it was armed resistance on a scale the German command had not expected from a population it believed to be thoroughly disarmed and broken. In France, the wider pattern of disguised and legitimate ambulance traffic alike became part of the fabric of urban resistance during the liberation, contributing to a climate in which German garrisons in cities like Paris found themselves unable to distinguish ordinary civilian and medical movement from clandestine military activity, a confusion that worked steadily in the resistance's favor as August 1944 wore on. The tactic's legacy outlived the war itself. The deliberate blurring of protected and combatant status, whether by resistance movements against occupiers or by irregular forces since, remains one of the most persistent and most legally fraught features of asymmetric warfare discussed today in exactly the terms the Geneva Conventions were drafted to address. Few physical artifacts survived to be displayed in a museum case because there was no single vehicle, no prototype, nothing patented or preserved. What survives instead is testimony. The accounts of couriers like Vladka Mead, later published and archived, and the fragmentary records of French resistance networks pieced together by historians from interviews, memoirs, and the occasional surviving operational report. Return for a moment to that white vehicle on Miła Street, its red cross catching the April light, its cargo of stretchers and bandages and 90 seconds of ammunition rattling gently as the wheels find the cobbles. It was not an invention in the way a rifle or a radio set is an invention. Nobody drew its blueprint, nobody tested it on a proving ground. It was, instead, an argument, made silently and at enormous personal risk, that the rules an occupying power claimed to live by could be turned, however briefly, into a weapon against that same power. It worked because the alternative, treating every ambulance as a potential threat, was unthinkable to armies that still needed their own wounded moved safely. It worked because ordinary people, mostly women, mostly unarmed themselves, were willing to sit beside a stretcher loaded with someone else's chance at survival and drive it past men with rifles who had been trained to look for exactly the wrong thing. It worked. When it worked, for 90 seconds at a time, for one sack of potatoes at a time, for one loaf of bread at a time, across a war fought in millions of such small, unrecorded acts. No factory built it, no general commanded it. It was carried, quite literally, in the hands of people who had almost nothing else to carry it with. That, in the end, is the whole of the story, and perhaps the only monument it needs. Not a vehicle preserved behind glass, but the simple, stubborn fact that when every conventional means of fighting back had been stripped away, someone still found a way to drive straight through the middle of it.